So our speaker today is Dr. Gavin Ashenden. He's a former Anglican priest and a bishop. He was admitted to the Catholic Church in December of 2019. Gavin Ashenden is an alumnus of King's School, founded by St. Augustine of Canterbury in 597, probably the oldest school in the world. Although he began studying law, he felt a vocation to the Anglican priesthood and switched to theology. He taught psychology of religion at the University of Sussex and is a well-known media priest. Dr. Ashenden was honorary chaplain of Queen Elizabeth, but also was for a long time part of the ecumenical priesthood of the Little Brothers of Jesus, Charles de Foucauld. The first lecture he will be giving to us is titled Garabandal de Buenos Aires, Marian Apparitions and the Eucharistic Miracles, Signpost to Conversion and Reconciliation. In this lecture, Dr. Ashenden will tell us about his way to the Catholic Church. And in a time of rationalism and materialism, it is good to listen to the signs God is giving us in the miracles and in the Marian apparitions. As is told to us in the example of Mark 16, they shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay their hands on the sick, and they shall recover. Therefore, I am very glad and honored to introduce to you Dr. Gavin Ashenden. Please give him a warm applause.
Thank you very much for your kind welcome. And there will be a translation into Dutch near the back. So if suddenly people begin to shift their chairs further and further away, I'll assume it's not a matter of personal hygiene, but that you need to have it translated for you. This could be an exercise in egocentricity and self-indulgence as I tell you about my story. But the only reason for telling you about my particular story is that I hope it contains a framework for a much wider experience. We live at a time of particular crises. I could spend a while dividing the last 2 millennia into 500-year pieces and give you a small lecture on the crisis at each of the end of the 500 years, but that would be a distraction, I think, from our main purpose, because we already know that Christendom and the Church has reached a moment of profound challenge in a global culture. And one of the weaknesses of the Church is the way in which 500 years ago a movement of reform turned out to be a movement of fragmentation. And so one church, wounded in 1054, suddenly became 1,000 churches. 1,000 churches with different presuppositions, different understandings of the gospel, and a profound incapacity to love each other or cooperate. If the church is going to offer a powerful witness that can be redemptive for our culture and face the political and intellectual challenges that have been thrown at it, it must recover some of its original organic unity. And so my rationale for becoming a Catholic is not any form of nostalgia or reversion into tradition for its own sake, but because I began to realize that my own spiritual pilgrimage had taken me further away from the gravitational center of the faith and had begun to remove from me aspects of the experience of God which were not optional but which were absolutely critical. And I'm going to talk about the Mass and about Our Lady. I misunderstood the role of Our Lady from early on. I couldn't understand why in my Anglican tradition some people were fascinated with her. I thought it was some kind of psychological displacement of sexual identity. Perhaps priests who hadn't got on well with their fathers were amplifying this maternal figure. We were full of all kinds of psychobabble solutions to theological conundrums in those days. And one of the things that surprises me most is that I had no idea of the apparitions that have peppered the Church's experience from the very earliest years. One of the earliest ones occurred in the year 240, where Gregory, a Syrian bishop, was sitting demoralized in his cell because he had an episcopal responsibility to re-evangelize that part of Syria. And suddenly, Eusebius tells us that Our Lady appeared with the Apostle John. And we don't have an exact transcript of the conversation, but essentially she said, "What are you doing, sitting on your backside, giving up? You are required to go and evangelize, and the Lord Jesus will be with you, and it will be successful." And he did, and he was. And if you like, from that moment, there have been a cascade of apparitions. And again, the Protestant misreading of this is very serious, because there is always an assumption that Mary, as she appears in the Catholic tradition, does so as an alternative feminine goddess, as some form of idolatry. It's almost impossible to get a Protestant past their initial suspicion that this is some form of Canaanite fertility worship reappearing in the Catholic psyche as a challenge to the lordship of Jesus. Whereas we know, of course, that Mary's role is always to make herself a vehicle for bringing everyone to Jesus. That's what she does, and that's at the heart of the apparitions, as we'll see. I want to put in a small background, because I myself am struggling with why it is so difficult to tell the truth, both about Mary and about the Mass, and to be misunderstood or to be not heard. We might take a spiritual narrative. If we look into the New Testament, what we see there are a number of examples of gradated or staged apprehension. So perhaps one of the most familiar ones is with the healing of the blind man in St. John's Gospel. He comes to Jesus, and Jesus lays his hands upon his eyes and says, "What do you see?" And he says, "Well, I see something. I see people moving around like trees." And then Jesus comes to him again, and the healing is complete, and he sees people. There's no explanation in the Gospel as to why it took two stages like that. And I won't begin a process of theological explanation now. It might have something to do with Nicodemus establishing this paradigm that evangelicals seized upon quite rightly, which is, if you want to see the kingdom of heaven, you must be born again. There has to be some mystical explosion into being that is more than rational and physical, that expresses the coming into Christ of the soul. We know that at the moment of resurrection, the same kind of gradated perceptions took place. We have the disciples on the road to Emmaus, and there they are walking with Jesus, and it's him, but they see him and they don't see him. And we have Mary Magdalene, of all people, should recognize Jesus' voice and face immediately, but even Mary Magdalene doesn't. And so preachers will tell you it was that her eyes were full of tears. Always we look for reductionist explanations. We don't know why she didn't see him, but she didn't, until he spoke to her, and then the full picture emerged. So we have through the Gospels already a picture of the soul's journey, which is marked by periodic moments of revelation. And that ought to be an encouragement to us all. It's not just the mark of a semi-Protestant who suddenly sees the whole fullness of the Catholic faith. It applies to all of us, that there is a deeper perception that we are invited into. After all, Evagrius Ponticus described the Christian journey as one of purgation, illumination, and union, and I think quite rightly. All three acting as a cyclical rather than three periods of translation, all three going on at once. But part of this is illumination. We see things we never saw before. And as I look at my journey as a Christian, I can't find a rational explanation for why it has taken me so long to see clearly. But I want to tell you about my encounter with Our Lady, because I think she's enormously important. Important because one of the frameworks in which we understand our faith is the struggle between good and evil. I was deeply mistaken in thinking that Our Lady acted as some kind of psychological antidote for aberrational gender acceptance. Actually, Our Lady, as we see from both from the book of Revelation, is she who reverses Eve's failure and crushes the serpent under her feet. And you may have discovered, as it took me a long time to do, that from people involved in the ministry of deliverance, where evil is confronted with skill and authority, evil has a particular fear of Mary. Again, it's hard to explain why. The demons don't offer a theological rationale for why they find themselves particularly disaccommodated by the praying of the rosary and by the invocation of Our Lady's prayers. But it may be to do with the fact that Jesus they know about, rather like that encounter in Acts where the demons say, well, we know about Paul and he worries us greatly, but who are you? In one sense, the demons know about Jesus. Jesus is the incarnate Son, the Logos, the Word, in whom all things hold together. But Mary is a real problem because evil had humanity sussed. The corruption of Eve was a paradigm that runs down through human experience. And for one woman to reverse this, as Mary did, and by the means of her reversal, to allow Christ into the world, the significance of her reversal is that the whole of the story of redemption hangs upon her reversing Eve's disobedience and her saying yes. And we'll come at the end, I hope, to the way in which Mary acts as an antidote to feminism and to an ideology of schism and rebellion. The targets in our discussion with our secular culture are changing. In the 1990s, when I was teaching psychology, the real problem was Sigmund Freud, because Sigmund Freud had created a climate which did two things that were very difficult for Christian culture. First of all, he inducted our European society into the sexualization of identity. This notion that our profoundest force inside us was some aspect of sexual longing, which if it wasn't indulged would cause any number of illnesses. And the other difficult thing he left with European culture was the threat that if you had religious experiences, you were mad. There was something seriously ill about you. And so one of the reasons why still I think people are frightened in talking about spiritual and mystical experiences is the threat of Sigmund Freud still hangs over us, that the people who have these experiences are somehow irrational or neurotic or pathologically disturbed. And this has muted the Christian witness of what we might call the spiritual for a moment. Actually, when you discover how Freud came to that, it is so ludicrous. You wonder how on earth European and 20th century society could have been so duped. He was used to psychiatric hospitals where he saw people who were profoundly psychiatrically disturbed doing all kinds of pathological repetitive exercises. They would wash their hands. They would repeat sort of various almost superstitious routines in order to make the world safer. And although Freud had little experience of Catholicism, though he was caught once by his nurse at the age of 3 in pretending to preach a sermon from the top of his family stairs, he'd been taken to mass and been profoundly influenced. And if things had gone the other way, perhaps he would have become a powerful priest in the Viennese church. But they didn't go that way. And instead he became a psychiatrist, and he went to a particular psychiatric institute and watched these troubled figures repeating various choreographed movements. And having been taken to mass in Vienna, he said, that's the same. This highly repetitive choreography, which looks almost automated to me, it's clearly linked to the repetitive movements of patients in mental clinics. And therefore I propose that religion is a form of mental illness. Now you may think, how is it possible that surely I must have misdescribed it? Perhaps I haven't given Freud his due intellectual depth of explaining the theory to you. But actually that's all it was. There was no study, there was no intellectual background. It was only one church in Vienna. He didn't go into other European cities. He didn't go into other denominations. He didn't do anything that looked like a competent investigation. He simply reached a conclusion and then imposed this. And from this, throughout European society, came this sense that there was a link between religious experience and some form of mental disturbance. And it began to silence European society. There was in England one man who was a professor at Oxford, a professor of biology, and he was called Sir Alister Hardy. And during the First World War, he had a very profound mystical experience in the trenches. And he wondered if mystical experiences were more common than he knew. So on a 3-year research trip to Antarctica, he put a little notice in the newspaper saying, if you have had any extraordinary religious or mystical experiences, please describe them on a piece of paper and send them to this post office box. So he hired a post office box in Oxford Post Office and went away for 3 years. And when he came back, he discovered he had a huge bill because he had been written to by thousands of people. But there was no means within ordinary society of expressing these experiences. And these experiences, of course, covered the whole panoply from people who were genuinely psychologically disturbed. There are psychologically disturbed people. It is difficult sometimes to distinguish between one's own internal trauma and experiences. And they came from, I think, what we would recognize as demonic disturbances, and also from genuine encounters with the divine. And he decided he wouldn't categorize them, he would simply collect them and leave it for other people to categorize them. The work of the Alister Hardy Religious Experience Unit, as it was called, became enormously useful because, in psychological terms, what it did was it undermined Freud's assertion that all religious or spiritual experience was somehow related to mental illness or psychosocial disturbance. Because some of these experiences are immensely profound and very striking. Some are ludicrous, some are alarming, but when you encounter them, you realize you're dealing with something very real. And for a Christian, at any rate, it confirms what we would assume, which is that the living God constantly tries to communicate with people through encounters of one kind or another. And they get mediated, it's true, and distorted by psychological distress and by evil, but nonetheless the phenomenon is there. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were 3 psychologists, and they seem to me to have been at the root of the difficulties that Christendom faces. They were Freud, Adler, and Carl Gustav Jung. And each of them proposed that a different solution for humanity's basic urge. And Freud said that the basic urge was essentially sexual. And Adler said it was basically about power. And Jung said it was really about self-development, self-realization. And in one sense, they're all right. These 3 urges certainly characterize human beings. And Christians have always said that our real urge is for salvation, for being forgiven and reconciled, for discovering who we truly are at the hands of the God who made us and loved us and came to find us. But amongst these 3 psychologists, 3 different narratives were set up. The Adlerian one found itself expressed in various utopian movements, the most dangerous of which, of course, is Marxism. Freud set this extraordinary climate. One has to ask, why is it that European society, Western society, was so willing to accept what Freud said? Was it Freud's extraordinary, was it something about Freud himself that managed to convince people, or was there something about in Western society that wanted to believe what Freud was telling? And I think it's the latter. But around about 1990, there was a great change in culture. And Freud's influence gave way to Carl Gustav Jung. And Jung's particular heresy was a form of existential idolatry. Jung talked a great deal about God and a great deal about spirituality, But as so often, he meant different things from the way Christians understood these words. And for him, God was the self. It was a developing self, a form of, whenever you hear an educator or a social psychologist or a politician saying, the really important thing is we must allow people to develop their full potential, what you're really hearing is a third-rate narrative of Jung's ideology of individuation, which he never explained and never tested, but which has grabbed a society that is a little narcissistic and very keen for us to become everything we want to be without ever describing it. And somewhere in the 1990s, Jung's ideas of the conflation of opposites and the concentration on the developing, emerging self began to overshadow Freud. And whilst we had been fighting Freud and in so doing, trying to legitimize religious experience as a means of making people more sane, not expressing their insanity, the target changed, and Jung came in, and Jung was profoundly spiritual. He brings a kind of psychology of spirituality, but located, focused on the emerging self. The difficulty Christians have, therefore, is by trying to express to our society something of the authenticity of a God with an entirely different character from these self-serving, narcissistic traits. And I was astonished when I first encountered the miraculous in terms of apparitions of Our Lady and the Mass. In one sense, the miraculous was partly solved by the work of Sir Alister Hardy, by putting on the map the fact that an Enlightenment empirical view of a materialistic world, which was not porous to anything mystical or metaphysical, was possible. And Jung was quite helpful in also acting as an antidote to the Freudian emphasis on sexuality, but neither led towards Christianity. And I was one of my lines of interest has always been in some of the writing of the mystics in the Middle Ages, where again there was a much greater sense of ease with the mystical and the transcendent, and the porousness of matter to the work of the spirit. And there have been a number of 20th century mystical voices, and one of the ones I was reading, which came under the category of private revelation, was talking about Our Lady's apparition at Garabandal. Well, it could have been anywhere, but it was that particular one. And the reason why it struck me as important was because if Our Lady appeared in 1963 in northern Spain, unlike Fatima in 1917, or Riedebeck, or the experiences of Julian Norwich in 1485. In 1963, you had video cameras. And I thought it would be very interesting to see what they captured on camera in 1963. And so I sat at my computer in my university office, and I was involved in looking at the photographs and the video footage of Garabandal and trying to understand what I was seeing. Because I had no experience of the apparitions. I was illiterate. And unfortunately, some well-meaning person had put a soundtrack to it that sounds to me much more like a gothic horror movie than anything appropriate. And in the middle of my watching the video footage, which is grainy and jerky and really quite primitive, a colleague of mine who, as a postgraduate psychologist, walked in and said, "What on earth are you looking at?" And I said, "Well, I really don't know. I'm trying to decide whether this is some mass hallucinogenic event or whether it's a contrick of some kind, or if it's real, why it's real and what it signifies." And so she looked at the children's faces and she said, "Well, whatever it is," she said, "it's authentic. And I said, well, how can you just walk into my office and say it's authentic just like that? She said, well, I'm a child psychologist, and actually we've been doing a lot of studies with children between 8 and 12 and ecstasy. So I'm very interested in what you're looking at. I can tell you now that whatever those children say is happening to them, they believe is really happening to them, because that ecstasy couldn't be faked. So she said, what is it? And I said, well, it's they're talking to Our Lady. Well, where is she? Well, only they can see her. So how do we know it? And then, of course, you'll notice that, in fact, in the footage, you have 3 children standing in a row, looking, at an object perhaps 25 feet away, 15 foot up, quite incapable of seeing each other, but crossing themselves in exact synchronized time that would make a military band proud. And there isn't any way in which this could be coordinated or managed or fixed. So something real is happening to them. So my psychologist friend said, well, if it is, it's quite clearly something real, and you say it's Our Lady, what's this about? I said, well, Our Lady is saying that she's giving a message to the church to pay more attention to the Eucharist and to love Jesus more, and above all to pray and to repent, and particularly to pray the Rosary. So my psychologist friend said, well, you better do that. I said, what do you mean I better do that? She said, you're looking at this to try and establish if it's real or not, and I'm bringing a certain number of skills from my work. I'm telling you that at the point at which you're asking the question, it is real. So since we're Christians, why don't you take the next obvious step, which is to put it into practice? And I said, well, of course I can't put it into practice. I don't believe in the Virgin Mary. I don't believe in the Rosary. Beads, what are beads? Protestants don't like beads at all. And I said, I can't possibly go so fast. Nonsense, she said. We don't have time to wait. You should immediately organize a Rosary prayer group in this university. Quite obviously. I said, I can't do that. Yes, she said, of course you can. How many people do you need to pray the Rosary? I said, well, I don't know, but perhaps if you have one per decade, 5 people would be good. Well, there's you and there's me. There's this person, she's lonely, she'll do anything to be affirmed. We'll add her in. She's always looking for a group to join. And then X is a Catholic, and he's been complaining the Catholics aren't having a Rosary prayer group. So we need one more person. And then some of you will recognize the drama of this kind of event. And as she said, we need one more person. There was a knock at the door. So the door opened, and it was a postgraduate student who was writing a PhD on certain aspects of poetry. And he came in and he said, what are you talking about? He said, well, my friend said, we're talking about starting a Rosary prayer group, and we need one more person. Well, she said, this is terribly fortunate. My mother has just died, and I promised her on her deathbed, the last thing I promised her was I would join a Rosary prayer group as soon as I found one. I've been looking one for days now. Count me in. So I know this sounds a little bit dramatic, but I mean, that's actually what happened. So we began to pray the question was, how do you pray the Rosary? Well, we had to learn and find out. Interestingly enough, as we prayed the Rosary, we found, all of us, a pressure on our private lives. A few weeks later, we prayed it once a week together, and sometime later we came together and someone said, how have your lives been since we started praying? And the answer was, actually, this has been a very tumultuous period. And we began to have a sense that we had entered a dimension that there wasn't a matter of placid, benign, self-referential spirituality that made you feel better, but we might actually be biting off something slightly more than we could chew. There was some real turbulence around in each of our lives, as if we had begun something that was creating some kind of backlash. So we wanted to be very, very careful about this. And then, if I can be personal for a moment, I had a very strange experience indeed. Round about this time, I found myself attacked by the demonic. This is not something one talks about in polite company for fear of Freud. So I hope you won't, I take the risk of hoping you won't worry about my psychological stability. You may have other reasons for doing so. But one night, I woke up at 5 to 11, and it was if, during this period of my life, it was if the wall in my bedroom had opened and become a sewer out of which poured black boiling oil. And it poured over me and it burnt me. It burnt me physically and it burnt my soul. And it had two characteristics, and they were despair and guilt. So I found myself in a profound state of despair, and there was a sense that it was all my own fault. So I lay awake for hours with this thing happening. It's very hard to describe how it clearly wasn't really happening, but at another level, it really, really was happening. And I remember, I thought, well, I had better get some people to pray for me. And I rather foolishly reached for my phone and sent texts to people in the middle of the night saying, something dreadful is happening to me. Please pray for me. To people I thought wouldn't think I was too mad and I knew had some kind of life of prayer. But the next morning I had a very good friend who was the Roman Catholic exorcist for the Diocese of Leeds in England, a man called Father John Abberton. And John was an extraordinary priest. And I thought, if anybody will know what's going on, it will be John. So I phoned him up and I said, John, either I'm having a nervous breakdown or something pretty dreadful is going on, or it's what it looks like it is, which is some form of disastrous assault of evil. So he listened to it. He said, well, you're not having a nervous breakdown. I should say it began at 5 to 1 and it ended at 5 to 5, sort of like that. And I've had enough psychological strain in my life to know that crises don't happen at 5 to the hour. We begin and turn off just like that. They take a longer while to kick in and a longer while to go away. And John said, no, this is certainly real. I said, well, what can I do? He said, there's only one thing you can do. What is it? I said, please, what does a good exorcist recommend? He said, well, the only thing I'd recommend is you pray the rosary. And I said, I'm not so sure about the rosary. He said, that's my advice, take it or leave it. So I took it. And astonishingly, the next night at 5 to 1, it repeated in exactly the same way. And I began to pray the rosary, and I stayed awake until 5 to 5 and continued praying the rosary. And it weakened slightly, but I wasn't very well. This was now the second night I'd gone without sleep, and this was a really terrifying experience. All the more terrifying for not happening in the daytime, but suddenly happening when outside one's control, as if one was a puppet or an experiment or something. And then the third night, the same thing happened. 5 to 1, it started again. But on the third night, weaker still, and I continued to pray. And then about 3 o'clock, something odd happened, and I have to introduce you to part of my domestic dynamics. My wife tapped me on the shoulder, and I had just fallen asleep for the first time in 3 nights, as it began to weaken. And she said, I'm very worried about you having a nervous breakdown. I don't understand what you're describing. But you'll only make matters worse for yourself by causing domestic trouble. And I said, what domestic trouble? Dear, don't stop bothering me. I've fallen asleep for the first time in 3 nights. This is a very important moment, and you wake me up. She said, well, it is your job to close the bedroom windows in the nights, in the spring. It was spring. She has a particularly well-developed sense of smell. Once upon a time, she went out into the road and she took the gas engineers to a gas leak that even their instruments were having trouble discovering. So in order to manage, not be kept awake in the spring, we closed the bedroom windows for her sake. It's my job. And she said, I know you're having trouble, dear, but it's still your job to close the bedroom windows, and you haven't done. And I'm now being kept awake. And what you're going through is bad enough without 2 of us losing sleep. So, you might consider paying more attention to things that matter, like closing the bedroom windows. And I said very grumpily, I did close the bedroom windows. Woman, leave me alone. And she said, now, this is very serious. Not only are you not doing your jobs, but you're starting to lie. And you know much how I hate lying in our marriage. I said, I did do my jobs. I'm not lying. Woman, leave me alone. Tusk, tusk, she said, with only the kind of the patience that an aggrieved wife can bring to bear on a situation. And she got up and clearly went to close the windows for herself. And then she came back, and I had my only moment's satisfaction for 3 days, because I knew what she would say. She said the windows were closed. I said, I told you I closed them. Well, then she said, you need to explain why the room is full of the smell of roses. I said, well, I know enough to know that in the mystical tradition, if Mary comes, she usually comes accompanied with the smell of roses. Now, she denies she said the next bit, but I'm sure she did. She said, well, you've been clacking those beads for 3 nights. It's about time she turned up. I can't explain how this experience came or why it came at this particular moment, but it had the effect of wedding me to the Rosary. We had also we had bought a house from a landlord who had let it to some tenants, and when I bought the house, I went round to look at it, and I saw these tenants who were New Age hippies, were engaging in some rather unpleasant forms of magic. I happened to know the books they were using, and I saw them lying around, and, oh, this is trouble. And we discussed it, but we decided that we could, it was our job to redeem the house. That was what Christians are for, surely. So we bought the house and continued. But one of the things that we found was whenever I went away, icons were thrown off the wall in the middle of the night. And there was one particular part of the house that was very cold and very inhospitable. And I did many of the right things. I blessed the place. I celebrated a requiem mass. I sprinkled holy water. And it reduced it a bit. But nonetheless, my wife found it difficult when I left because it still continues. And I find it very difficult when you leave because it's not nice being woken up in the middle of the night as an icon which we've fixed very firmly against the wall, nonetheless, gets thrown off. And we then began a rosary prayer group in the house. And I can't prove to you that it's causation or correlation, but it stopped. And so slowly I began to get the sense that the rosary does what the church has always said it does, which is to act as a profound means of engaging the power of the kingdom of heaven against the disturbance and the difficulties of the other side. As I began to explore the apparitions, as it happened, I was part of a renewal group which contained the theologian Abbé Père Laurentin, who died about 2 years ago at the age of 99, and he was the Vatican's primary authority on the Marian apparitions and has written the most incredible dictionary of them all. And it gave me the opportunity to talk them through. And so I've tried to become better read. And I don't think I can offer a global explanation of why Our Lady appears, but she usually appears at times of crises, and it's extraordinary how little people know about it. So there is a group of Catholics who do know about it, and she forms part of their spirituality. There's a group of Catholics who don't know about it and don't like the Catholics who do know about it and think they're being over pious. And the Protestant world knows nothing about it at all, and yet. And that's really very surprising. If you take, for example, Zaitun in 1968, I became quite interested in this because I was 14 in 1968. And well, I should have heard about this. It should have been on the television every night for a period of over 3 years, from 1968 to 1971. There was something like 250,000 people on the streets of a suburb in Cairo. And the apparitions of Our Lady over what had been taken to be the place where the Holy Family had taken refuge in Egypt were photographed endlessly, and they were the stimulus of healings and conversions to Christianity. There's even a point when I went to visit myself, I was standing on the church, and opposite the church is a large cathedral that's nearly finished. And I asked my guide, "What's that?" And she said, "Well, that's a cathedral in the honor of Our Lady." I said, "But this is a Muslim country. What is a Muslim country doing allowing this cathedral?" "No, they're not allowing it, they're paying for it." Well, I said, "This is even more mysterious. Why are they paying for it?" And the answer was because Sadat believed the apparitions were real. And without going into the theology of how Islam looks at Mary, which is a complication, decided that the Egyptian state would be best served by bulldozing part of the suburb and building a Christian cathedral in her honor. So, when you go to people and you say, I suspect the apparitions in Zaytun in 1968 are real, but it's not just me, it's also the Islamic government who paid a considerable sum of money to build a Christian cathedral, because they too think so. It adds a degree of authentication to the process. At least it gives us something to discuss and to talk about. And as one looks at the different apparitions, they all appear to stand for the concern Our Lady has to call the church back to a deeper repentance, a deeper prayer, a deeper discipleship, a deeper apprehension that the kingdom of God is profound and real. I was very disturbed when, for a while, I had a radio program, and my local Roman Catholic bishop, who was a well-known, charming modernist, I interviewed him for the program, and afterwards we sat down and had coffee together. And I said, "So what are you doing next week, Bishop?" I said, I'm taking a diocesan pilgrimage to Lourdes. And I said, "Well, but how wonderful," I said, "to be able to go and visit the shrine. How marvelous to take people in wheelchairs. I mean, as you know already, the scrupulous investigation of miraculous healings has a very substantial number of authenticated ones, and a vastly bigger number of ones that haven't been authenticated but people claim." And I said, "But how wonderful to be able to take your people to go and pray at Lourdes." "Well," he said, "you don't imagine that I think that Mary actually appeared to Bernadette." And I said, "I do imagine that, Bishop. Yes, I do imagine that you should think that." Well, he said, "Of course I don't. She was a disturbed teenager who somehow gained the attention of the church, and this turns out to be a useful site for pilgrimages and sociologically gathering people together and going somewhere together and having a quality of relationship, and this is all very helpful, but no, of course we don't believe that she actually appeared." I said, "But then, Bishop, how do you explain the fact that on the ninth apparition, Our Lady said, 'I'm the Immaculate Conception,' and and these illiterate children would have had trouble pronouncing the words, let alone encountering them, and they couldn't read. Where did they get this from?" Startling the parish priest as they chanted the words under his window to let him know what Our Lady had said. He flung up the window because, as it happened, there was theological discussion taking place in Europe about Our Lady's Immaculate Conception. And suddenly he had these wretched children from the grotto chanting these words, almost in the same way that in the patristic eras people chanted parts of the creed at each other in marketplaces. But I was astonished. He didn't believe it. And I began to get a more sophisticated sense that the treasures of the experience of the church are not obvious to everybody. When it comes to I then found myself looking at the Eucharist. I might as well go the whole hog and tell you the whole story because it's quite interesting, though you may have trouble believing it. But again, it came from the same period of my life as my encounter with Mary. I was in Le Puy in France, which is actually a place of a very early apparition, one of the earliest, in fact. And I'd had a great surprise because I was walking along a street in Le Puy. I'd gone there on retreat, and there were buildings which overhung the sidewalks or the pavements, with eaves of a building of about 2 meters long. And a Catholic priest approached me. I was on holiday, on a retreat clothes. And I'm always interested in other priests because I like to look at their eyes to see how their souls are. And as he came to me, I thought, oh, this is a good one. I like this one. and we passed. And we had gone about 30 feet, and suddenly there was an enormous crash, and the building above us collapsed with tons of rubble, missing us by about 10 feet. Now, I have no idea why, as our paths should cross, this building should collapse, very nearly killing us, but not quite. But I thought, oh, something's up. This is no ordinary retreat. I've just nearly died, and so did he. And in Le Puy, there is a wonderful chapel dedicated to St. Michael, built in about the 10th century. And there was Mass there, and I was making the weekly Mass the centre of my pilgrimage. And when I went up, I met the celebrant as he came, and as always, I enjoyed looking into his eyes, and I liked what I saw, and I thought, well, this will be... I have slight tendencies towards, towards Donatism, the sect that St. Augustine saw off. I could easily become a Donatist if I wasn't careful. I looked at the quality of this priest and I thought, no, he's a good one. This will be a good Eucharist. That's entirely wrong theologically, by the way. It's an aberrational suspicion. Pay no attention to it, but I'm slightly given to it. And then during the Mass, I again experienced something demonic. It was like a circle of bats. You know how the plug hole works. You get a kind of a sort of cyclone of water in a funnel, and it was almost as if there was and they were dive bombing me, and I couldn't hear the liturgy. I thought I was having a stroke. Always one looks for a reductionist solution if one comes to hand. And so part of me was very worried I was ill, and another part of me, do you have a video camera at the back of your head that stays working at all times? Just assessing the situation, irrespective of any other kind of panic or joy. There's just a little camera that says, what's going on here? So my little camera was beeping away red and said, well, this will be interesting. And I thought, why on earth should it has never appeared before? This makes it sound like my life is a perpetual struggle with evil, but these are about the only 2 experiences I've ever had, so you're getting them out of context, I'm afraid. And again, they died bombing, and they did the thing of despair and accusation. You're in trouble, there is no hope, and it's your fault, which I think are the marks of the other side. And I thought, well, this is terrible. How can this happen in a chapel dedicated to St. Michael, the Archangel, of all places? And how can it happen in the middle of a proper Latin Mass? Actually, it wasn't Latin, sorry, a proper Catholic Mass. And when will it stop? And I thought, well, perhaps it will stop at the epiclesis, when the Holy Spirit's invoked of the elements. So it didn't. Or perhaps it will stop at the elevation, hoc est meum corpore. It should do, but it didn't. And in those days, I'm sorry to say, I received in the hand, which is a mistake for me. And I thought, perhaps it will stop when the host is placed in my hand, but it didn't. But as soon as the host touched my tongue, everything just disappeared. And I thought, well, I need to think a bit more carefully about the Eucharist. I don't think I spiritually understand. I can offer you all kinds of theological lectures on the Eucharist that I've gathered over 40 years, but that isn't the point. There was a level of spiritual insight that mattered. And I then became interested in the Eucharistic miracles, because I thought perhaps they might offer the key. And again, I don't know if I'm talking to experts on the Eucharistic miracles or not, but as I began to explore them, I thought, this is a wonderful time in which to live, because you may know, of course, that perhaps the most famous of the modern Eucharistic miracles. I mean, you can buy books that tell you of all kinds of exciting and miraculous things that happened through the Middle Ages, and some of them are well written, and some of them are a bit folksified, and some of them are unbelievable, some of them are hugely impressive, but they're quite a long time ago, and it's impossible to get any closer to the event. But in 1996 in Buenos Aires, something very odd happened. a host was dropped in a church, and the present Pope was the bishop, in fact, of the diocese. And the priest, as he said, would normally have consumed it on the spot, but it had got dropped in a very dusty place, and so it had a lot of dust on it, and he decided he wouldn't consume it, he would put it in a glass of water. So they put it in a glass of water in the vestry. And 3 days later, when he came back to assume that it would simply have disintegrated, he discovered it appeared to be bleeding. So he told his bishop, and his bishop said, "Lock it away." So they locked it away for 3 years. They put it in an airtight container in water, and in 3 years, when they came back to it, it was still bleeding. And so they sent it to a laboratory in America in order to be investigated. And when it was investigated, the science said that there were living white blood cells, and that it appeared to be tissue taken from a particular ventricle in the heart, and the heart showed signs of enormous suffering. And the scientist in the New York laboratory said, "Where on earth did you get this? People don't often turn up with pieces of human tissue taken from the human heart after a period of suffering. The police might like to know exactly what the provenance of this object was." And when he discovered, he didn't believe it, and then they had to go back through all the witnesses. And then the question was, well, is it water? Because again, this wouldn't survive if it was water. If it was hydrochloric acid, it would have survived. But so is it water? And it turned out to be water that it was in. And in the last 15 years, there have been a number. There was one in Tixla in Mexico, 2006, one in Sokolka in Poland, 2008, one in Legnica in Poland in 2013. They've all been tested, and they all give the same scientific result. Now, to a lot of people, this is ludicrous. Catholic theology doesn't require you to believe this is actually, realistically, but science tells us as it is. I mean, constant science. So this is not a debate we're having with agnostics or with Freudians or with detectives who think somehow some trick has been pulled. It's science for once has come to our aid instead of attacking us and tells us that something real is taking place. Interesting, you probably know that one of the earliest Eucharistic miracles took place in Lancia in 750, where in answer to a priest complaining to the Lord he didn't think he believed anymore. Then the host bled, and it's still there. So they have taken part of this host and they discovered that the same scientific result is obtained. If this is the case, then two of the central elements which were damaged by the Reformation, and in the damaging of which split the church into 1,000 less impotent pieces, two of the elements which were rejected and damaged turn out to be immensely important, both spiritually, theologically, existentially, and historically. And they are the role that Our Lady plays in redirecting the church in penitence to prayer and adoration. And they are the fact of the Mass, which all the 1,000 reforming agencies decided was to be dismissed for some reason or another, and gave 1,000 different reasons. Well, what does one do if one discovers that both Our Lady and the Eucharist are always what the Church said they were? The answer is one gets as close as possible to her. And so perhaps as we ask questions about the kind of ecumenism that the Church should be engaging in, the sort of conversations that should take place between different parts of the Church, and we move from a period of time when it was luxury to a period of time when it is absolutely necessary in terms of what is coming on the Church. And I'll be talking a bit about that in my next talk, if you have the patience to stay. Then an encounter with Our Lady's apparitions and what they signify, and a revivified understanding that the Eucharist is what the Church has always said it was, may be key to saying to the rest of the Christian world, this is something that you should be and could be and ought to be drawn towards. Thank you very much for your patience.